and heavenly armor will enter the land, and battle belongs to the Lord.
Well, now's a really good time. By the way, one or two visitors around the place. My name's Lloyd-Williams. I'm the pastor of this church, Brixworth Community Church. It's a great privilege to bring God's Word with you now, and that will be a lead into just sharing communion together. Now's a good time, whether it be on your phone or tablet or hard copy, just to get your Bibles out and turn to the book of 1 Samuel, and we're going to be looking at many verses in chapter 17. It'd be really handy for you if you have God's Word just to open it up to 1 Samuel 17, and well, not necessarily today. Normally we'll perhaps go through verse by verse, or there'll be an order to it, but we're going to be flitting around, if you like, flitting around that chapter of 1 Samuel 17. We're going to be reading fairly shortly, but first I just thought I would ask the thoughts really when it comes to sports. One or two people around the place know I do enjoy a little bit of sport, but when it comes to sport, we as a nation, we do like to cheer on the underdog, don't we? We do like a decent giant killing from time to time. And so, the top 3 giant killings of all time, according to a recent poll conducted in 18 Stonehill Way, Brixworth, poll of 1, I might add. I thought that was quite funny, thank you, sir. In third place, we do have Wigan Athletic. Yes, beating the mighty Manchester City and their millions to win the FA Cup in 2013. Second place, here we go. Second place, Emma Raducanu. Yes, coming through qualifying to beat seed after seed and win the US Open, was a giant killing winning tournament in 2021. It certainly was. But here we go. Number one, it's been a very good weekend for Leicester City fans. It's been a very good weekend for Leicester City fans. Number 1, first place. Yeah. Here we go. The greatest underdog story of all time, the greatest giant killing sporting story of all time. And there it is, yes, little old Leicester City, winning the Premier League in 2016. A giant killing winning season, so to speak. Can we just look at that picture? What a picture. What a picture. We have a laugh. Maybe you have your own opinions of such sporting trivia. But the phrase giant killing, of course, originally comes from the Bible. It comes from the book of 1 Samuel. And the moment really where David, this young shepherd boy, defeats and kills all 9.5 feet of this giant Goliath. And the basic premise of the story is so well known actually that it's very much written into the fabric of our society, and yet contained within its details that are actually not so well known, are very, very challenging and encouraging, important truths for us to take hold of. Truths not just about, the beating and defeating the sort of giants of our circumstances. No, it's much more than that. It's encouragements and challenges about honouring God's name and how God prepares us for His service and how we might be victorious in our Christian life, but in His strength. And so actually, it was a pretty important battle. It still is. So let's read its detail now, and consider a few of these things in the short time we have, and then that will lead us into communion. So reading from 1 Samuel 17, reading from verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me, if he is able to fight and kill me, and we will become your servants. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Take an ephah and roasted grain, these 10 loaves of grain for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning David left the flocks in the care of the shepherd, loaded up the sheep, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp, and the army was going out in its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites have been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage, and he will be exempt and his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the man standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying, and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's older brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, and with whom do you lead these few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried out the sheep from a flock, I went after it and struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, put on a coat of armour on him, and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic, and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and the sling in his hand, and approached the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with a shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked at David over and saw that this was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give the flesh and the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that this is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, but the battle of the Lord. But the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down onto the ground. And so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from his sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head and the sword. When the Philistines saw that the hero was dead, they turned and ran. Okay, just 3 points this morning. Firstly, this God's name was being dishonoured here. God had chosen the Hebrews, who became the Israelites, to be his people. He miraculously brings them out of Egyptian slavery and into the promised land, and they are to take the land, and his people are to honour his name. And there's this running conflict that they have with the tribes and peoples within the land, and one of them is the Philistines. And so we come to this moment in history, it's about 1,000 years before Jesus, where the Israelites find themselves up against the Philistines. And there's this giant, as we heard, named Goliath, who decides really on this rather novel way to resolve this impending battle between them, which is this represented from each of the army. They fight each other in the middle of kind of these two hillsides, right in the valley there, and a kind of winner-takes-all battle. That is, that the loser's nation becomes the slaves of the winning's nation. So really this is an extremely high-stakes, one-on-one fight to the death. And in verses 8 to 10 is where Goliath, he laid out the terms, didn't he? He said, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come to me. If he is able to kill me, he will become your subjects. If I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight," he says. Which clearly the Israelites and King Saul, they agreed to, because Saul in verse 25, I don't know whether you spot that, Saul, he kind of lays out his reward, as the people of Israel, they say. They say, the king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will give his daughter in marriage and exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel. And Goliath, this great giant, he shouts this thunderous threats every day, threats that would no doubt have continued on, if you like, without a different outcome, because all of a sudden, arriving on the scene, 40th day, if you like, is David. David arrives on scene, and he hears these threats, and it's like, uh-oh, game changer. And he says to the man standing near him, he says in verse 26 there, he says, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Of course, there's an interest of a reward there, but he's far more concerned, really, of this defiance against God and God's people. And it reveals a little bit, really, what this battle is about, or who this battle is really between. Because, yes, it's between David and Goliath, and you could say David representing the Israelites and the Philistines. But, or even in the language of the Bible, it says the armies of the living God, or those of the uncircumcised. But actually, really, it's between, all of God's people who should be honouring God with their lives and trusting in Him and crying out to Him and not quaking in their boots. As to all those who do not belong to God's people, who do not honour God's people, do not honour God and His name, well, sometimes they defy God and sometimes attack God's people. But here in 1 Samuel, the people of God have forgotten this. They've forgotten that they are representing God here and honouring Him and trusting Him and calling out to Him. And because if they did, they would know in their hearts the truth that every Christian today can know in the face of attack and persecution. That they would know that if God is for you, then who could be against you? But they don't know this, because they have forgotten all of this. And they're consumed with fear. It says that they're afraid. At one point it says they were terrified. It says this on numerous occasions in that reading, doesn't it? Because they are without faith. But again, that fear would be, without faith, you would have that fear. Because in those early verses we read this detailed description of Goliath going out to taunt them every day. It's an incredibly scary description, isn't it? That detailed description, verses 4 to 7. I can't say that I personally would be kind of in a hurry to face this guy. There's graphic details, isn't it, of this bronze helmet and this javelin and this coat of armour and scales on it. This coat of armour, scales on it, it says. Does that remind you of anyone? Scales on it? It's almost like a snake, isn't it? This great big giant snake. Again, does that remind you of anything in the Bible? A snake? Of course, it's the serpent, isn't it? Yeah, it's the devil. And again, it's that kind of reminder, really, of what this battle is really about and who it's between. Because it's less about a giant and a shepherd boy, but more about the honour of God's name that should be seen in the lives of God's people. And it's about the defiance of God by those attacking God's people. Like the Philistines, like Goliath, who just don't know it, but they are like the puppets on the end of the devil's string. Yeah, the Israelites are not concerned about God's honour here. They're more concerned about being pinned by Goliath's javelin and losing to the Philistines and ending up as their slaves. And the only incentive really the king comes up with is a kind of cash offer, this tax exemption for the family of the victor and the daughter in marriage, who apparently is a little bit of a nightmare, so that's not much of a reward. And it takes a real character, a David, so to speak, to remind them of the real battle that's really at stake. Now, before we sit in judgment on then God's people, let alone, let's be honest and admit some things to ourselves. The calling of God's people, whether in Old Testament times or New Testament times, really in many ways remains the same, which is that we are to be people who honour God's name. Not in a kind of self-indulgent, smarmy, we are God's people, so hard luck to the rest of you. No, for the Christian, it is that we are God's people by the utterly amazing grace of God through Jesus, by His Spirit, so that we might declare to the world His praise and live for His honour, not our own. The Apostle Peter writes to the Christians in New Testament times, he says this: But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, people belonging to God, that you might declare the praises of him who calls you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not the people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received, but now you have received mercy. And of course, it's when we forget this high calling to declare the praises of him that really many real problems arrive. And of course, for Israel, it was in the shape and the form of a 9.5-foot giant. And today, the church of Jesus Christ, it's under attack, if you like, by the giants of secularism and a kind of anything goes morality within society that sometimes seeps its way into the ranks of the church. Perhaps it's already seeped its way into the Christian circles that we kind of might mix in. And are we going to be in fear and quake in our boots and wait for a David to turn up and do something about it? Or do we have a concern and honour for God's name? Well, we need to. We need to have a concern and a regard for God's name. You know, we as a church not that long ago have gone through line by line the Lord's Prayer, and there's a reason why the pattern is the way it is. Then go on to talk about the kind of personal prayer requests till halfway down the Lord's Prayer, but at the very start it says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Now, we're going to need to pick our battles along the way. So, you know, if I'm thinking of challenging someone's behaviour or perhaps write a letter to the media, you know, we need to ask ourselves first, is this really about me? Is this really about me defending my reputation? As opposed to God's reputation, because if it is, we will lose. And if we don't lose immediately, we will lose in the end. But if not, it's about actually defending God's reputation and God's honour. We will discover that, you know, God is with us. He is with us, he is for us, he is right there by our side, and God honours those who honour him. And so firstly, we see from here that God's name is not being honoured. Secondly, though, we do see, you know, David, God's servant, he had been prepared. As during this standoff between the two armies, or you could say a shout-off, Jesse kind of lets his youngest have a break from shepherding and take his brother some supplies while they continue to kind of knock their knees in the sight of Goliath. Not that the eldest Eliab was grateful when David comes with these supplies to him, and he begins attacking him, doesn't he, and accusing him with wickedness and pride and this kind of slander. Not to mention accusing him of being really unconscientious with the sheep, effectively leaving them to the wolves. He said there, didn't he? He said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." So we need to know that David was being far from conceited. You know, very humble in fact, because in the previous chapter he's just been anointed as the future king of Israel, and yet very humbly he's very happy just to go back into the fields and carry on looking after the sheep. But then you also need to know this, that if you are about to be used by God in whether it be in small moments or even significant moments which require great courage and sacrifice and faith, and I've got to tell you, not everyone's going to be encouraging about it. No, sadly, the devil uses on occasions those closest to you, whether it be blood family or those in your church family, to discourage you away from God's will, with comments and lies and slander or whatever it be, maybe just silence never really encouraging you at all. And it shouldn't be that way, but I can tell you from my own personal experience, it certainly is that way. And so look, you know, don't look for automatic applause from such people. Trust me, it won't come. Seek your significance and your reason for serving from him, from God. And that will keep you going through those times of discouragement. And have spiritual discernment as too. Don't be thrown off track by those who are not spiritually minded. Those who don't have a heart after God's own heart. I've got to tell you, if I'd listened to many along the way, then, ultimately people close to me, people that I love, but also ultimately people who just still to this day don't really know why I do what I do, don't have a heart after God's own heart. If I had listened to those people along the way, I would never had gone to Bible college for 4 years, gone on different ministries. I would never have done this job here at Brixworth for the last 8 years. I wouldn't have done this job really for the last 15 years. And in David's case, Eliab, his eldest brother, he's not spiritually minded. And so, David's not thrown off track by him. Because Eliab didn't have a heart after God's own heart. A kind of heart-to-heart relationship with God. If he did, he would be the one. He would be the natural one to have been anointed as king, as the future king. But he's not. David was. David would be king. Just not yet. Not yet. And and the not yet in your lives is no wasted time. Even though he's gone straight back into the fields to be a shepherd boy. But God's hand has continued to be upon him. He's been training him, in shepherding for leading and kingship and the art of leading and guiding and protecting. As well as preparing him really for that kind of mighty next challenge along the way, which is facing Goliath. And all this David mentions, doesn't he, in that sort of job interview that he has with Saul. Saul is very sceptical about sending this little boy to do a man's job. But David tells him, he said, look, I've killed lions and bears, and so really, Goliath is no problem. And although it's not specifically mentioned, you can imagine all those hours and hours of practice with that sling, that he would be very accurate indeed with it. And this is all part of David's preparation. And when we become a Christian, the Spirit comes into our lives, it comes to empower our lives, and all the time really is preparation time in some ways for the future. There is no wasted time when we're walking with God and we're in his will. God is always using us in the present, sometimes in the mundane ways, sometimes in big ways. He's always using us in the present, but he's secretly and invisibly and equipping us for skills and experience for the future, including the things in the future that perhaps can feel really daunting. But God yet has been preparing us along the way. And so you can't even really spot the fact that sometimes he's preparing you, particularly when you go through long times of thinking, it just feels like this is such a waste of time. But actually God's got his hand on you and he's preparing you. It's only a few years later that you're able to look back and go, oh yeah, that's why I had to go through what I had to go through. And so if you want to be a kind of giant killer for God, then you've got to learn something. You've got to learn how to walk with God and just prove him in the small things. It's only when you're kind of faithful in those small things, in those hidden areas sometimes, that he increases the size of the challenges along the way. As one Christian writer puts it, he says this: for David, it was lions and bears alone in the wilderness before a great giant in front of him, in front of thousands. So God's name is being dishonoured, God's servant is being prepared. Finally, there's a great victory that is won. As David gets the nod from Saul to face Goliath, which from a human perspective is quite puzzling, of course, as the fact that Saul allows this young, inexperienced man or young man to sort of represent Israel in this battle, it's kind of baffling, really, in some ways. Particularly with so much at stake. But God's answer to why David is chosen is quite different, isn't it? It all happens in the previous chapter, because there God anointed David as the future king. But he anointed him as the future king because he had a heart after God's own heart. And it means this, it means the one who seeks after God's heart in a kind of heart-to-heart relationship with God, and they do that by faith in God through Jesus, they will be used to fulfill his plans, sometimes in significant ways. Goliath, interestingly, is all that a man is without faith, isn't he? He's the kind of the person that you would naturally look to in this situation. Because he's got this height, and he's got this strength, and he's got this equipment and armour, and he's filled with contempt for the enemy. He's filled with this contempt of David. He says, I am a dog that you come to me with sticks. He says, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds, he says. But David answers how this victory will be won. Verses 45 to 47, he says, you come against me with a sword or spear or javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And then with the first of 5 smooth stones that he's gathered in a little stream, the stone, it leaves David's sling, and travelling 100 miles an hour, no doubt, it embeds itself in Goliath's forehead, and it crashes to the ground, and the rest is all part of Israel's and Philistine history. But you have to say, you come to watch the fight, getting all excited, you'd be quite disappointed, really, wouldn't it? Because all that sort of long build-up, took me a while to read those verses. And yet it's all over so quickly. It reminds me, doesn't it, of those sort of heavyweight boxing fights with those weeks of build-up and the press conferences and the weigh-ins, and there's probably one of them is pretty gobby and he's mouthing off to the other boxer, and the other boxer comes and he knocks him out in the first few seconds. Or it reminded me of, because it was on last night actually, it reminded me of that Harrison Ford who stars the Indiana Jones film, and what's it called? Thank you. Raiders of the Lost Ark on last night. That's right. Did you watch it alone? Yeah, no, we didn't. Okay. Seen it many times. Well, you'd have known that actually. There's a moment in that film, isn't there, where he's on the run from all sorts of people, and then sort of quite some way away, that Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, is faced with that kind of karate expert with all his stuff, and then the karate expert, he's kind of there postulating, he's kind of giving out all these moves in front of David. It goes on for ages and ages and ages, like this. And then all of a sudden Indiana Jones pulls out his gun and just shoots him and moves to the next battle. Yeah, if you come to watch the fight, you'd be disappointed, because it's all over in a moment. It's all over in a sling, if you like, of David's. The one stone in David's sling. But if you come along really wanting an important message, then you'd have got one. You'd have got one, because the battle is the Lord's. And the victory is the Lord's. And it was the Lord who delivered David. It's the Lord who delivered Israel by combining those things that we thought about. By combining, if you like, years of preparation of David. Combining his experience with those lions and bears and that practice of that sling. Combines those things with faith. You have to bring faith into it. Combines those things together, experience and preparation, with that faith that David has. And David becomes God's chosen instrument. God's chosen instrument. And it's that brings us to the communion table.